Canadian couple Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka appeared to be love's young dream. They were the ideal couple. Their friends and others who knew them called them the Ken and Barbie couple. They seemed perfect for each other. But underneath the seemingly ideal relationship, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka were far from a match made in heaven. Nobody would have ever been able to guess the hidden level of evilness in these people. They were animals. What drove this seemingly charming couple to their brutal crimes? There was Carla Homolka raping and torturing right alongside her husband, and she seemed to be enjoying it. Paul Bernardo was born August 27, 1964, in Scarborough, which is in Toronto, Canada.
So even though he was said to be a happy child, he came from a broken home. His parents were always fighting and his home life was just very unsettled. He did Boy Scouts and he went on to be a camp counselor when he was a teenager. He was very athletic. He was a lifeguard. As a teenager, he took karate lessons. He was just very confident. He always told his friends he could get any girl he wanted.
When you look at him, you'd think this guy is a very professional, confident person who didn't have any doubts about his own ability. Although he had had such a rocky home life, he was still a confident person, and anyone looking in from the outside would never have assumed there was something else going on inside of him. When he was 16 years old, he figured out who he thought was his biological father was actually his stepfather, meaning that Paul was the result of an extramarital affair. This news to him not only made him resentful, but made him even more angry at his stepfather. Although he hated his stepfather, he did have some things in common. They both were caught peering into other people's windows at night.
He was known to be a peeping Tom. He would just spy on people all the time, look through people's windows, and those were just a couple of the early signs that people were like, maybe he's a little different.
Kenneth, Paul's stepfather, was charged with pedophilia and molested Paul's sister while he was growing up. When Paul became older, dating other women, his girlfriends began to reject him. Over the course of his relationships, he enjoyed degrading his girlfriends in public. Over time, his relationships became shorter, and Bernardo would frequently date more than one woman at the same time. In all cases, he was abusive and threatened to kill his girlfriends if they spoke to other people about the treatment he subjected them to. In 1987, Paul's girlfriend at the time threatened to go to the police. That's when Paul no longer dated girlfriends or was in relationships and began his raping spree as the Scarborough Rapist. Between 1987 and 1990, many women in the town of Scarborough were being attacked, raped, and tortured by the Scarborough Rapist. Detectives were unable to find the individual suspect between the Scarborough rapes, causing a fear for the citizens of what used to be a quaint, safe town of Scarborough. The Scarborough Rapist was very manipulative. Somehow he was able to insert so much fear into his victims that even when he attacked them on their own property, they were not able to call for help. His attacks were becoming more and more aggressive and violent. FBI agents told detectives that if this guy is not caught soon, he will escalate into murder. In 1990, after 3 years of terror for the city of Toronto, police got a break in their search for the Scarborough Rapist. For each of his 17 known assaults, he'd been careful to make sure his victims were unable to describe him. He let his guard down when he was confident enough to attack the female from the front. This victim was able to assist the police in creating a composite sketch of the Scarborough Rapist.
In May of 1990, the police decided to show the composite sketch to the public. And that launched a massive search all across the country, and a lot of tips were coming in. At that time, Paul had quit his job, and he was making money by smuggling cigarettes through the U.S.-Canadian border. And his friends and previous girlfriends, people that had known him all his life, were coming forward with tips and saying, this looks kind of like Paul, it sounds like something he would do.
Some of them tried to contact the police about Paul Bernardo, but since officers were so overwhelmed with the amount of tips they were getting, they were unable to follow up on all of them.
Two detectives went to Paul and they took his blood, hair, saliva.
At the time, the DNA samples were not used, and Paul's DNA sat on the shelf for 2 years. When he was asked for his DNA samples, he put on a face for the police. He was very comfortable with them. He even said, I want to do anything I can to help find the suspect. These DNA samples that were taken from Paul Bernardo would much later prove that he was the Scarborough Rapist. Meanwhile, Carla was falling deeply in love with her new boyfriend, Paul Bernardo.
In 1970, Carla Homolka was born in Ontario. She had 2 younger sisters, Lori and Tammy. Carla was a bright child and a good student that was doted on by her father, but he would also insult her and her mother and sisters during his drunk episodes. From a young age, Carla was described as stubborn and domineering. She was unable to compromise with other children well and was always willing to speak her mind to adults.
Carla Homolka was a sweet girl. She grew up in a middle-class family. She always had good grades. She had a solid background. She grew up in a small town, a well-off family. Her mother worked as an administrative assistant at a hospital, and her dad made his money off of, selling lamps at flea markets, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Homolka got a part-time job at a pet store while she was in high school. And after graduating in 1988, she was hired by Thorold Veterinary Clinic as a full-time veterinary technician.
In her teenage years, she always was on the popular side, always had a date and a boyfriend until she drifted off to a little bit of a darker phase. She started becoming interested in the occult. Her friends say that after the death of their pet, she asked if she could dig it up because she was fascinated by death. A few years later, at a pet store convention, she met the man of her dreams, Paul Bernardo. They had an instant, yet fatal attraction. Paul Bernardo was everything Carla Homolka had ever dreamed of, both as a child and as a teenager. He was older, tall, blonde, handsome. She called him her prince. He had a car, he had a job. He ticked all her boxes. He was basically the perfect boyfriend. Unlike many of Paul's other girlfriends, Carla Homolka was very accepting towards Paul's behavior, and instead of rejecting him for what he did, she submitted to his actions and encouraged his sexual behavior. He started controlling her whole life. He would tell her how to dress, how to style, what to eat, what to believe. He called her fat and ugly. Surprisingly, she didn't reject this, but instead she made a self-improvement list for herself so she could fit what Paul wanted. Paul Bernardo had a thing for girls with virginity, but as he was dating Carla, he became upset that Carla was not a virgin, and he asked her to arrange for him to take her younger 15-year-old sister's virginity. Instead of being appalled and rejecting Paul's request, she decided to surprise Paul with her sister's, Tammy Homolka's, virginity as a Christmas gift.
December 23rd, after a little Christmas dinner with the Homolka family,
she didn't want Tammy to get hurt, so she stole anesthetics from the vet that she worked at. They put anesthetics and drugs into her meal as she ate, stayed up with her until she passed out. That's when the raping began.
So after she passed out, they began raping her and things began to get aggressive. Tammy began to vomit and Carla tried to hold her down to clear her throat, but just nothing they did really worked. So after they failed to revive her, the couple dressed her, moved her back into her room, cleaned up the evidence, and then called 911. Even though she had a visible chemical burn on her face, her death was ruled accidental and the story that they told was just taken. And at the funeral, Bernardo, or Paul, was caught stroking Tammy's hair as she laid in an open casket.
In 1993, in an exhumation of Tammy's grave, they found a photo that Carla and Paul snuck into Tammy's grave. Homolka says about her younger sister's rape, "It was an opportunity to minimize risk, take control, and keep it all in the family." So as we can tell, she wasn't actually sad about her sister's death. What's even more surprising is she became very impatient and got enraged with her parents when they suggested delaying hers and Paul's wedding, and it had only been a few months after Tammy's death. She wanted the focus to get back on her, and Carla wanted the attention. I just don't know how someone would do that to their own sister. This was the beginning of Paul and Carla's sickening new chapter. On June 29th, 1991, Leslie Mahaffey was found. She had been missing for 2 weeks. Her parents had a rule that if she stayed out past her curfew, they would lock the doors, but if she just knocked, they would let her back in. On June 15th, Leslie Mahaffey happened to be out past her curfew. Unfortunately, on that same night, Paul Bernardo took a detour on his way to steal license plates in Burlington. He decided to steal license plates to use in his smuggling business when he met a 14-year-old girl, Leslie Mahaffey. Convenient, right? No. Leslie had been locked outside of her home after staying outside past her curfew. After Mahaffey was offered and accepted a cigarette from Bernardo, Bernardo led her to his car where he pulled out a knife on her, blindfolded her, and drove her to his house. The reason why he brought Leslie back instead of just attacking her on her own property like he used to with his victims, his rape victims, is because he told Carla that instead of having to attack and run, he wanted to have someone in the comfort of his own home. And because of this, it would be Leslie Mahaffey that paid the price for Paul's sick fantasies. Like all psychopaths, Paul Bernardo had a charm. He was remarkably successful in his manipulation. Bernardo engaged scripting of his victims. He told them what to say. He made them tell him how great he was. Just like his girlfriends in the past, he enjoyed degrading his victims, and he took pleasure in causing them humility. Carla's initial response was to go back to sleep instead of checking on Leslie. She filmed themselves as they raped and tortured their new victim. After Mahaffey's blindfold slipped, they decided to murder her. They kept the body of Leslie Mahaffey in the basement while they dined with the Homolka family upstairs. So this means when Carla's going downstairs for Sunday dinner to get things out of the freezer, she's literally walking by a dead body. Later, they dismembered her body and encased her remains in 8 concrete blocks and threw the blocks into Lake Gibson. These blocks with remains were later found on June 29th, the same day that Bernardo and Homolka were married. It's kind of funny because also on June 29th, the same day Leslie was found in chopped up bits and pieces in cinder blocks in Lake Gibson, that same day, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, that was their wedding day.
On April 16th of 1992, Bernardo and Homolka abducted their second victim, 15-year-old Kristen French, as she exited the Holy Cross Catholic School. They basically saw her walking on the sidewalk and just kind of surprised her and forced her in the car. And they brought her back to the same basement and tortured her and raped her for 3 days before strangling her with a cord, which was suspected to be the same cord they used to kill Leslie. During Kristen's captivity, she was never blindfolded, and she was forced to ingest large amounts of alcohol, watch the recording of Leslie's rape, and act in a submissive manner to Bernardo. After they strangled her, they threw her remains into a ditch after keeping the body in the basement for a couple days. Bernardo was interviewed by 2 police officers a month after French's murder, but they considered him an unlikely suspect even after he admitted to being interviewed previously in connection to the Scarborough Rapist. Soon after, Bernardo and Homolka solicited to change their legal name to Teal. That's the surname of a serial killer in the 1988 film Criminal Law.
Sus.
After the murder of Kristen French, Paul started becoming a little delusional. He was really abusive towards Carla and started beating her up.
On December 27th, Bernardo savagely beat Homolka with a flashlight, leaving her with bruises on her limbs, a broken rib, and 2 black eyes. She returned to work about a week later, still with a lot of injuries. She tried to pass these injuries as a result of a traffic accident.
Yeah, so her coworkers did not believe her story. They didn't believe her, and they alerted her parents, who then insisted on taking her to the hospital. So when she got there, she switched up her story a little bit and claimed to be a battered spouse, and then she filed charges against Paul, who was briefly arrested.
At this time, by sheer coincidence, the samples that Bernardo had been given 2 years earlier were tested right around this time, positively identifying him as the Scarborough Rapist.
So Carla Homolka sought full immunity from the prosecution, in exchange for her cooperation, which was denied. She was given a week to accept a 12-year prison term for the manslaughter or face charges for 3 murders. And one of those was Tammy's, her sister, whose case had just been reopened. So she took the deal for the 12-year prison term, and then she testified against Paul in his trial, which took place in 1995. So the Ken and Barbie killers are going against each other.
On September 1st, Bernardo was sentenced to life in prison without parole for at least 25 years. In 2007, Homolka, after being released from prison, she ended up marrying Thierry Bordelais, the brother of her lawyer, actually. And they had 3 children together, and the family later returned to Canada. And now they are settled. And yeah,
so that's nice.
So if you're ever going in Canada and you want to spend some time in Montreal, is it Montreal or Montreal? But either one, whichever they are.
Canadian serial killer for the win.
You might meet someone named Carla. Will the Ken and Barbie killers strike again? Ken and Barbie are now Barbie
no longer
minus Ken.
Yeah.